Welcome to part number 9 of my Software Heresy series. What do we think is true that might not be true? And for this episode, I'm going to move into a little bit more into the agile world, and I'm going to talk about retrospectives. And since I'm always talking about things in the negative, this episode is entitled No Retrospectives. And here's my usual warning or caveat slide. Heresy can be uncomfortable, can even be a bit insulting in some cases. Try not to take it too personally, but I actually want you to take it a little bit personally because I want to get you thinking enough that maybe you'll think about doing something different or more deeply examining how you do things. So, we're talking about retrospectives. And if you go out on the web and you search for retrospectives, agile retrospectives, you'll come up with a ton of information out there. So I went out there and I just did a search and picked up some pretty pictures and diagrams, and that's what's on this slide. And there's a number of different ways you can do retrospectives, ways you organize information, way you run things, and here are some examples that kind of talk about that. And as usual, for most of my talks, I'm not really concerned that much about the details because I'm talking about kind of high-level things or meta-level things. So we're going to hop up at the meta level. And I'm not going to talk a ton about details of retrospectives, well, a little. But I'm going to start by talking at the meta level because I think the meta level is where most of our big improvements can come from. It's not in improving the small things, it's in taking new perspectives on what we're currently doing. And that's pretty much what this whole series is about. So to do that, I need to talk about two words that are linked together. And the first word is a word called ends. And ends is a kind of a weird word to use here. You might think goals is probably a better word to use. But I'm using ends very specifically because of the other word I'm going to use. Ends are just the things that we're trying to accomplish. So since we're talking about retrospectives, the whole goal that we're trying to accomplish for a retrospective is we're trying to improve our team. So trying to improve our team processes so that over time we take a process that isn't great and we move it forward. And move it forward in a set of steps by changing things. So, you probably figured out why I chose ends. The other word is means. And means are ways of getting to ends. So there are things that we do to accomplish specific goals. And one of the important distinctions between these is that there is this implied belief or assertion that means will lead us to ends. So, as you're probably noticed, if you've watched the other things in this series, I tend to go off on tangents, and I needed to go off on a tangent here. And we're going to go back to the 1940s, to World War II. And I'm sorry the pictures are so bad, but that's kind of what I could find. And in World War II, the Japanese and the U.S. primarily fought in the Pacific, on the Pacific Islands. And as part of that, they would come to an island and they would essentially set up shop in the island. And that often involved building airstrips because shipping things across the Pacific is really big. It takes a long time to move ships. So a lot of things moved by airplane. So they would build landing strips, they would build docks. Airplanes would come in and they would bring all the things that either the US or the Japanese needed for their bases. And some of those things invariably trickled down into the native or indigenous populations of those islands. And some of those things were actually quite valuable to those peoples. They got tools, modern hand tools would be very useful. And so a large variety of things were very useful. And then a few years later, the war was over and the planes stopped coming. And what happened was that the people were unhappy that the planes had stopped coming. They were hoping to still have those things show up. So they built what you can think of as replicas of the things that they saw during the war. So in the left picture, we have at the top, there's a control tower, or kind of a replica of a control tower. And then in both pictures, we have these planes. And their hope or their belief was that by doing this, that would bring the planes back. And this ended up being termed as a cargo cult. And a cargo cult is a belief system in which adherents practice rituals which they believe will cause a more technologically advanced society to deliver goods. And there are really two important parts of this for my discussion. The first is they're doing something that is a ritual, and it's something that they believe will lead to a specific goal. So what they're doing is a means, and they hope that it will lead to a specific end. Now, pretty clearly, and one of the reasons this is interesting, is that in this case, it's pretty clear that this belief is not really going to work for them. They're going to do these rituals, but it's not going to bring back the planes the way they were before. So they are using means, and these means are not going to achieve their ends. How does that apply to retrospectives? Well, some two interesting questions to ask you. What evidence do you have that your retrospectives are effective at accomplishing your goals? How do you measure the effectiveness of your retrospectives? What I'm really asking you is, how are you validating that the means that you're employing, the retrospectives that you're doing, are actually effective at accomplishing the ends that you hope they are going to accomplish? My assertion is that in many cases, retrospectives are often just ritual, or mostly ritual. They're means, but they don't actually serve the end. And I need to go off on another tangent here. I joined Microsoft back in 1994. And that, of course, was pre-agile. But we did this process called a postmortem. And you'd spend time working on a software release, might be 2 years, might be 3 years. You'd ship it. Everyone would breathe a sigh of relief that you'd finally shipped. And then you would have a postmortem meeting. And in the postmortem meeting, you'd all get together. You'd talk about things that went well, things that didn't go well. You would somehow collect those and categorize those. And some program manager would write up the notes from the postmortem, and then you'd assign people to work on them, and then you'd go off and you had done the postmortem. But what I noticed was that postmortems really weren't very effective. You talk a lot about things, but you really didn't actually see a lot of change come out of them. And a number of years later, I got a chance to run a postmortem when I knew a little bit about Agile and how retrospectives work. And I decided I was going to take a yellow sticky approach. So we all got together, we all had our yellow stickies, everybody wrote down a set of yellow stickies of things they thought, things they thought we should talk about and improve. They all went up on the board, we did categorization and mute mapping and put them together, and came up with all of this information, very detailed information. And after we finished that, I had a number of people come up to me and say, that was the best postmortem I've ever been to. I really, really liked the format. I think it was great. So I took all the output, took all the yellow stickies, I think I even recorded it and did a write-up from it. And then I sat back and waited. And you might have already guessed what I found. What I found was my approach made people happier, but it really didn't change anything. It didn't really move the bar in terms of what people changed. And I'd look out, and there were changes that happened, and there were changes that happened that were mentioned in the postmortem, but those were changes that people were going to make anyway. And in some cases, they'd already started making them. What we needed to get a change was someone who was passionate about it and willing to make the change and able to make the change. And everything else just didn't happen. So postmortems were ritual. We did them because you're supposed to do a postmortem. But if you go back and track whether they're actually effective, the answer is they're really not. So I'm going to talk about details of retrospectives and kind of what I see some of the issues are. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper. And I chose this approach, this graphic, because this is a common way of doing things. But you can apply what I'm going to say to pretty much most ways of doing retrospectives. So I'm going to start with yellow stickies. First goal of this approach is to write down a lot of things and categorize them into this board, or you categorize them in some other way. Generally, this step involves sitting around a bunch quietly with a pad of yellow stickies, and then writing things down and then putting them up on the board. And we have some allocated amount of time, maybe 20 minutes to generate all these and put them up. And I've spent a little time thinking about these, and I kind of came across something kind of weird. The majority of the stickies you write up will, first of all, the majority won't be discussed at all, or discussed just very, very briefly. And the vast majority won't result in any meaningful action by the team. So, you might end up with 20 stickies, and you might end up with only 2 action items coming out of it. That means it's this largely wasted effort by the team. We've been writing things up there, and they really don't help us achieve our goal. Remember what my goal is? I want to change how the team operates to improve. And the vast majority of these don't do that. I think that's weird. One of the prime guiding principles of agile is that we want to eliminate waste. And here we have this designed approach which pretty much ensures waste. We're deliberately spending time writing up things, and the majority of these aren't actually going to end up being used. They're just going to end up being typically thrown away. So that's weird. I find that kind of just puzzling. Maybe I should write a sticker about it and put it up in the puzzling category. I actually think it's actually quite a bit worse than that. What will often happen is we see a big range in participation at yellow stickies, at retrospectives. Someone like me, I might write up 10 things. Some of my developers or my reports, they might write up 1. They might write up 2. They might not write up any, just because they're not into this the same degree I'm into it. And that can be problematic. Let's say one of those people writes up a sticky and they put it up, and it's up in one of the action areas, so start or stop, for example. And they write it up and it doesn't get chosen. So we'll come back next period. They still think it's an issue. They write it up, doesn't get chosen. Come back next period. Next issue, they write it up. Well, 3 times, most people are going to quit. So writing down something several meetings in a row and not getting any traction is demotivating. And the worst part is it's going to especially demotivate the people who participate less. So the people we're explicitly trying to draw in and get more engaged when they write things up and they're never chosen, that encourages them to participate less because it just doesn't seem worth it to them. So that's problematic. And unfortunately, that's really not the worst part. The worst part is that when you first start a team and you're doing retrospectives, there's generally a lot of low-hanging fruit and people are fairly engaged. So you come up with something, it's like, oh yeah, we should do that. And you go and do that. And you come up with something, yeah, we should do that. And that's great. But you get a little bit into the process and you've gotten rid of the low-hanging fruit. And the team is actually fixing things outside of the retrospective. So you're starting to lose things. And then you get different sorts of things that show up. And one of the problems with a lot of these agile models is they assume that you're operating in a functional agile organization. There's this assumption that you have managers that are engaged about agile. They're doing servant leader sort of engagement. The teams you're working with are also agile. You're just in this great, happy, agile world. So you come up with things that where I need to work with this other team. We've been having this problem. Hey, we're just going to get together and solve it. We're all one big happy family. Where the reality is that just doesn't exist for most teams. Even if you're in a nice agile organization, you still have things like schedule pressures and you still have things like different charters. That team that I need something from has something more important from a business perspective to work on. So even though they'd like to help me out, they actually cannot help me out. It doesn't make sense from a business perspective. And that's really the best sort of situation. In a lot of cases, you have teams that aren't doing agile. You have managers that are at best agile tolerant, or they have managers that are at best agile tolerant. So what ends up happening is you start getting things showing up during retrospectives that the team actually cannot address. Because the problem isn't within the team, the problem is structural, and it's in the way the team relates to other things in the company, and the team doesn't have much traction to be able to change those. Or they certainly don't have traction to change all of those sorts of things. So what happens is we get what I call chronic issues showing up during retrospective. So we will have something that says, stop wasting time doing this with another team. Or we're having quality issues with another team. Those are things that we may not be able to address. But the problem is they show up, and they show up over and over because of the way the structure just takes this large view on what the problems are and what we can do. Having those show up chronically is both demotivating and distracting for the team. And I've seen multiple situations where it essentially just kills retrospectives. What happens is we show up, people try to get moving in a forward direction, but then those things come up and we end up rat-holing of discussions and blaming the other team and blaming our manager and whatever. And we just kind of lose everything out of the retrospective process. So my overall question is, why are we going to all this wasted effort? Why are we writing lots of things down that we know we'll never do? Why do we have a structure that demotivates the people that we really want to motivate more to engage? And why do we have a structure that focuses us on things that we actually cannot change? At least we can't change directly as a team. Maybe we can work on our relationships longer term, but this isn't something that the people in the room can actually fix. So this has all been really confusing for me. And I ran a lot of retrospectives and participated in a lot and kind of found this confusing. But it turns out there's an alternate approach. And I can claim pretty much no credit for this alternate approach. On one of my teams, I had this developer who just couldn't really engage in retrospectives. He'd show up, he tried to make an effort, but it just wasn't working. So we were talking about this, and he said he didn't really like the touchy-feely part about it, the celebrate success. He was just very action-oriented, goal-oriented. He liked kind of the idea of celebrate success, but he didn't like the touchy-feely part. He was looking at the process and saying, I don't think we really get a lot of useful things out of it. And to be fair, I actually agreed with him at the time. I was looking at the retrospective and saying, we did well at the beginning of retrospectives, but now we're kind of getting into this chronic problem case. And that's not really helping us. He just wanted to get back to coding. So he felt that this was an interruption in what he liked to do. So we talked about this a bunch and, tried to come up with better ways, but this was kind of just a mismatch between what retrospective wanted and what he wanted. And that was just something kind of ongoing. Then I did another report who was acting as Scrum Master at the time, and he came to the team with an alternative that he read about someplace. And I'd like to state that if you know who came up with this, please leave a comment. I would love to give credit to who came up with this because I think it's a phenomenally great idea. So he came up with this alternate, and what I'm going to describe isn't quite what the alternative was, but it's pretty close. So this is what I call the research meeting. And it's very deliberately not described as a retrospective because it doesn't work the way retrospectives work. Retrospectives are about discussing a broad range of things and then categorizing and coming down. And that's really not what a research meeting is about at all. So, what are the rules for the meeting? Well, rule 1. The research meeting is over when the team has agreed on a new research item that they will try over the next iteration, an interval or period, however you're structuring your meeting time. Notice that this is tied directly to an end or goal that I care about. My whole goal is that the team is improving their process on an ongoing basis. What is the goal of the meeting? Well, the meeting's purely designed to come up with a research item that we're going to try that we think improves the process. So I'm tied directly between what I'm doing here and my goal. Rule 2, well, there actually aren't any other rules for the research meeting. All I care about is that we find out about that thing. And there are different ways of doing this, but all I care about is the goal. So, how does it work in reality? What is the format really like? Well, the first thing we need to do is deal with whatever we decided to do last time. So we had a meeting before, we decided a research item. We have to figure out what happened with our research. What did we figure out? And more specifically, was the previous research item a good thing based on our evaluation standard? And there are really 3 things that can come out of this. First thing is, that's a great idea. We should adopt it as part of our standard process. And this happens quite a lot. I'd say at least over 50% of the time. We came up with an idea, we tried it, and everyone gets to the end and we say, yeah, we should keep doing that. And remember that adoption here doesn't mean that we won't decide to unadopt it at some time in the future. It was a small thing, we made a small change, and we decided it was a good idea. Second obvious thing, that was a terrible idea. We should stop doing it. I don't know what we were thinking. And this also happens sometimes. It doesn't happen that often. I'd say maybe 10% of the time. But it's really, really interesting that you can have, a whole group of people together thinking, hey, we should do this. It's like, no, that was just a bad idea. So that happens sometimes. If it does, stop doing it. We'll go on and try something else. There's a third state that comes out of this. Not sure will extend for another research cycle. And there are really 2 disconnected causes for this. The first is that we chose to experiment, or we chose a research item that we actually couldn't do during that period. So maybe we chose something that's very related to kind of our exploratory design part of our process. And then it turned out that during that period, we were buttoning up a release, doing validation, verification, all those sorts of things. And we didn't actually get to do any of the thing that was related to the research item. And at that point, we might choose to extend, do the same thing the next research cycle, if we think we're actually going to do it then. Or maybe we decide to kind of table that until we get back to that cycle again. So that can happen. It's not terrible. The other thing that can happen is we've just forgot. The team said, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to do this for the next period. And then it turns out, yeah, we just kind of forgot and didn't do it. That shouldn't happen very often. And when it does, it's important the team understand what happened. It's like, okay, so why did we forget? And kind of go back and reevaluate. And if you actually think that it's still a good idea and people are for it, maybe you figure out how not to forget next time. Or maybe you look at this and you say, well, maybe we kind of forgot because we just kind of didn't really think it was that good of an idea in the first place. So maybe you toss it out and come up with a different idea. Either of those could happen. So we've looked at the old one. We've evaluated that. And that's really pretty quick. Generally, it's like a minute or two. It's either really obviously a good idea or really obviously a bad idea. If it's in the middle, we generally say, okay, it wasn't very good. We're going to skip it. So that's pretty quick. Next, we need to identify the next research item. You can use whatever process you want for this. It could be somebody just has an idea and they mention it and you just agree. It could be you had an issue and you want to do 5 whys on it and go into some depth and talk about what is going on. Maybe you actually write up a few yellow stickies and stick them on the board. It's totally free form how you come up with this research item. And I expect the team to facilitate whatever is appropriate. Important parts about this research item: the team must agree to try the new research item. And by that I mean everybody on the team must agree that they're willing to try this. So this is something the team owns. We have to agree to try it. The second part, the team must come up with the evaluation they will use to judge the success of the new item. Now, sometimes you may be able to come up with an objective sort of measure. Maybe there was something I can actually measure about our process, and we think that ties directly to what we're trying to accomplish, and therefore we're going to use that on a measure. I found that to be in the distinct minority. It's like that almost never happens. So generally, the evaluation that the team comes up with is we're going to talk about it and decide just based on our gut reaction or our feeling whether we thought that was a good thing or whether we thought that was a bad thing. If you look at these, you can think of these as kind of borrowed from a scientific approach. The first part, identifying the item, and the team agreeing, is really setting up our experiment. We have an experiment and we're going to define up front what we're going to do, and we have an experimental group who's going to perform the experiment. And then the second part, the evaluation, is how are we going to evaluate whether the experiment is a success or not? And we're going to make sure we write that down ahead of time so that we're kind of keeping ourselves honest about the experiment. So, a few examples that came out of the team that I worked on, team that I led during this period. So, we had this issue. One of the people came and said, we're having this problem when we first start new stories. And sometimes it's not clear what the story's about. Sometimes we're not clear how it's changed, because we changed some of the implementation and we don't think this story is quite right or not. And what happens is we take the story, we go off and we start, and then we have to go find the program manager and come back, and we just we're not seeing good efficiency here. So we want to try something where we meet with the program manager whenever a new story is started. And that way we think that we'll have better interaction and better definition. And this turned out to be a very good thing. It later evolved into a process rule where when we take on a new story, we're actually going to publicly announce, and anyone who's actually interested in the new story can show up. So it'll be the developers working on it, the PM, and then sometimes other developers actually care enough to show up on that meeting. They either care about how it's implemented, or they have some details about something that they think is going to be relevant to the people doing the work. So that's one example. This team was pairing compatible. We liked pairing, but when we had this, for a while, we had this weird rule where we choose some stories to be paired on and some stories not to be paired on. And we actually had to have a discussion and stand up to decide which ones were which. And somebody came up with the idea that, well, we're pairing on like 90% of our stories. Let's just pair on all of them. And third one was to allow tripling. So pairing 2 people, tripling 3 people. And we had this case where we had some people who were developers who were less experienced in certain areas, and they wanted to learn more about specific areas, but they didn't want to slow the team down. So they were resisting pairing on those because they thought they wouldn't be much use. And what the team had discovered was that if you get 2 people who are quite capable in an area, and then you bring in the third person who wants to learn about the area, it works really, really well. So we kind of came up with this to allow tripling on stories if it made sense. So those are the sort of things and the sort of granularity that I expect for research items. They're small, very contained sort of things. Research meeting format, number 3. The facilitator writes down both the research item, what we decided to do, and the evaluation method, how we're going to evaluate it, on the whiteboard. This needs to be publicly available to everybody that this is what we're doing and this is how we're going to evaluate it. And then someone, typically the Scrum Master, is on the hook, not for us doing that task, doing that research item, but they're on the hook for reminding us that we said we were going to do that research item. So that's the basic format. What sort of benefits do I see? First off, all research items are ends. By definition, the fact that someone is proposing that a research item, proposing a specific research item means that it's something the team can do. Now, it may not be a great thing to do, may not be positive, but by structuring our group here in choosing things this way, we get rid of all those other things, the things we couldn't do. So both of those together are great at focusing the team on the possible. Now, you can make an argument that we should be working, on the hard things, and I tend to agree with that. But my assertion is that the hard things should actually more be the providence, not of the team as a whole, but more of a providence of Scrum Master, Facilitator, Lead, Manager, those sort of things. It's more of a sub-team that works on those sort of things rather than everybody. This approach emphasizes small, cheap, reversible items over bigger and risky ones. That is wonderful for this sort of process because small, cheap, reversible items are things that people are much more willing to try. You don't have to have long discussions about, hey, should we do this or not, because it's small, cheap, and reversible. It's much easier for someone to say, even if they're kind of skeptical, to say, yeah, I'll try that for a week, or whatever our period is. And they know that not only are we going to have a discussion in the next period, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. So if they're right and it's a crappy idea, they can certainly point that out. The whole team is responsible for the item they choose. And what a pattern I see a lot in retrospectives is you'll come up with multiple items. And multiple items inherently leads to specific owners. It's like, oh, you are going to go off and make sure we do this. And you are going to go off and make sure we do this. And that means that everyone else doesn't have to pay attention. It's like, well, it's not my job, it's their job. And that's really, in my mind, antithetical to what we hope to see for agile teams. So one item, whole team is responsible. It's a huge benefit from a focus perspective. Everybody has the same goal in the meeting. This is really important because you have someone like me who likes process stuff and likes to talk about process stuff. And you have that developer I was talking about who just wants to get back to coding. What I've given them is I've given them this meeting that actually aligns with their view of the world. I've given them a puzzle, find something that the team can work on to improve. And I've given them the actual kind of goal that they really like. Find that item and we're done. So what I've done is I've aligned my incentives, getting out in the meeting, with their incentives. They would just want to get out of the meeting. And that's something they can work directly towards. Maybe they have a great idea. Even if they don't have a great idea, maybe they can suggest a modification of the idea. And further, the evaluation of are we going to do this idea has to be everybody. So they have to participate on that. And the evaluation of what we think of the last thing also is an everybody activity. So they need to participate in that. So what I've done is I now have this approach that takes people that are not bought in or not really effective in the way they work in traditional retro meetings. It just doesn't align with their skill set very well. And I've given them a meeting that does align with their skill set. So this is great. Because of all of these meetings tend to be short. 20 minutes is a long research meeting. It would be pretty rare that you spend a full 20 minutes on this. Sometimes it only takes 5 minutes. It's like you come in, you've done something, everyone says, I think that was great. It's like everyone just nods, and it's like, yeah, that was great. Okay, we're going to keep doing that. That took like 30 seconds. And then somebody else suggests a natural progression. It's like, okay, we tried that, and we kind of talked about, we're going to try that and maybe do this thing in the future. So let's just try that thing in the future and see if that works. It's like, oh, okay, we'll just do that. Literally, all you have to do is agree actually how to express that new thing and agree on what your evaluation is. That takes another 2 or 3 minutes and you're done. And not only is it a really short meeting, but it's a meeting everybody feels really good about because you had this goal, come up with a new thing, and you accomplish the goal. Nothing better than a meeting where you accomplish your goal in a short period of time. You didn't spend any time talking about these things you can't change, all focused on this. So that is pretty much the end of my discussion here. Just to kind of summarize, the problem I have with most retrospective approaches is I think they have become ritual. They are things we do because we're supposed to do them. They are not things we do because they are effective in accomplishing our goals. So I'm happy that I have an alternative to propose, and I think the research meeting has just a tremendous advantages over retrospective. Not only is it more lightweight, it engages more people, it actually makes fundamental change in the group much faster. And I will say when my group adopted this, the difference both in how many things we were changing in process and how happy the group was just in general was significant. We were just, to simplify, we were just focusing on the things that we had the power to change, and we were improving our process. And that's great from a success perspective. So that's all I have for my heresy for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Look for me in the future for a new one.